And when I was a young teenager, I was reading drafts of his thesis and talking to him about it. The thesis was a scholarly edition of the work of David Kimchi, a medieval Hebrew grammarian. And part of the thesis is also about Semitic historical linguistics.
Hmm.
And all of this I found very interesting, talked about it a lot to my father, and it influenced my own work later. But also just the understanding that looking at the history of language and the prehistory of language can provide explanations for what exists.
Thank you. So I wanted to shift gears towards your thoughts about your father's work and also your own experiences as a Hebrew teacher and how that influenced your views about language and whether or not you consider this in light of Kabbalistic or mystical kinds of writings. Um, I wanted to read an excerpt for you from his book Hebrew, the Eternal Language, and uh, and maybe you can answer kind of uh, the first question in light of this quote. So um, he's there's this quote in the book Hebrew, the Eternal Language. Your father says, in investigating the origin of language and after tracing back its history as far as we can, we see that the earliest language was anything but intellectual, that it was indeed a sort of halfway house between singing and speech, with long, almost conglomerations of sounds, which served rather as an outlet for intense feelings than for an intelligible expression of them. Indeed, even in modern days, language is employed by children and often by grown people, not so much to formulate and express thought as to vent feelings. So that was the first part. If you'd like to.
Yeah. Well, actually, my father's work was influential for me, but not this book, which came out much later, 1950s. The work of his that I was influenced by was actually his PhD thesis,
Mhm.
which was published in the 1950s, but was basically written around 1940 or so. And when I was a young teenager, I was reading drafts of his thesis and talking to him about it. The thesis was a scholarly edition of the work of David Kimchi, a medieval Hebrew grammarian, who was working in the very rich tradition of Arabic grammar at the time and innovated by applying it to Hebrew. And part of the thesis is also about Semitic historical linguistics.
Mhm.
And all of this I found very interesting, talked about it a lot to my father, and it influenced was an influence in the fact that historic, first of all, in the descriptive character of some of the work there, which entered into my own work later, but also just the understanding that looking at the history of language and the prehistory of language can provide explanations for what exists. I can give you some examples, but it's an explanatory theory, basically. Now, structural linguistics, at the time, the reigning doctrines, as I learned later when I went to college and learned about it, was not explanatory. It was taxonomic. Saussurean structuralism was basically taxonomic science. You have procedures of analysis, very extensively developed, sophisticated procedures which enable you to find the units of that appear in some text and their distribution and their arrangements. That was the consensus around 1950. My own first work was actually on Hebrew. Uh, it was my undergraduate thesis topic, what was later known as a generative grammar. The term didn't exist then. Basically, a generative grammar of modern Hebrew. Modern Hebrew doesn't mean what they speak in Israel today. It means the language of the Haskalah, the Hebrew revival in late 19th, early 20th century. So it's modern as distinct from biblical, but not the current language, just changed in lots of ways. So that was the thesis, a generative grammar of that, which was concerned with the recursive enumeration of the infinite array of structures of the language and the way the rules were ordered to give you the exact forms they have. And it was an effort to find the simplest possible arrangement of those rules. And it was, a generative grammar is an explanatory theory. It's an effort to explain why the forms are such and such. And in fact, a good friend of mine, Israeli logician Yehoshua Bar Hillel, one of the very few people who looked at the thesis, suggested to me that it might work. There might be a better result if I used forms that were more similar to proto-forms of Proto-Semitic forms. That turned out to be a good suggestion. I redid the work on those terms. What was finally completed in 1951, later published, was basically that. So it was an explanatory theory which did make use of proto-forms, but as part of the mental apparatus of a person today. And this fits with some more recent biological discoveries about deep conservation, things that are conserved over very long periods of evolution and are found in existing species. This is, and somehow just remain. And that's maybe true of language as well. A later work of mine, Morris Alley's, my old friend, late friend, did study English, Russian, other languages, making use of similar ideas. Our book, Sound Pattern of English, is based on similar ideas. Morris knew Hebrew well. He'd grown up in Latvia. Hebrew was one of the languages of his childhood. And we did talk about thought about using some of the interesting phonetic discussions in the Kabbalistic literature, Sefer Yetzirah. It does have interesting analyses of phonetic features, which have some modern resonance. We thought about this, and we thought for a while of trying to put it in our own work, but we decided it would seem too exotic. So it's a topic that hasn't really been developed. We put it aside, but it is a possible interesting topic.